All right, well, thank you all for joining us again. Welcome to Digging Through History. Again, my name is Anthony.
I'm Jim.
And we today are going to be focusing heavily on 1800s.
Antebellum slavery.
That is correct.
There we go. That's a fancy word.
That's a good time. Yeah, can't use that word anymore though. Remember?
Well,
that's a
historically you can.
Historically you can, not in
Like can't be Lady Annabelle.
No, can't do that anymore because that incites negativity, racism. I don't know how, but it does.
It does.
Anyway, getting into kind of how things are all running, we talked last week, we talked mostly about kind of that precursor, how the colonies dealt with slave issues, how the Americas after the Revolution, how we dealt with most of that slavery issue. Gave you a little bit of spoiler alerts, kind of a little bit. But today we're going to focus heavily on really what caused the Civil War.
Yeah, that would be our target. Is what were the key factors? And obviously, two of the big factors were, of course, the rejuvenation of slavery.
Right.
In the South with the cotton gin, where we go from less than 1 million tons of cotton in a year to billions of tons of cotton in a year. The number of slaves almost quadruples over that same time frame. Mm-hmm. And that's despite in 1808 it being illegal to import slaves.
So you have to go to that homegrown style of slavery.
Yeah, but the racialization in the 1600s
mm-hmm.
of slavery in America changes it to, if you're black, you're a slave, with rare exceptions, and most of those exceptions live north of the Mason-Dixon line.
Exactly.
And then, of course, the second thing is the growing abolition movement, just the absolute, growing out of the churches in the north, especially Congregationalists.
Oh my gosh, yes.
They were a big mover in that. But like everything else, you see the Congregationalists are very strong in it, but they're mostly in the north, mm-hmm. coming out of the Pilgrim/Puritan movements. But the Methodists and the Baptists being big factors, they're split. If you look at a church today, a Methodist church, it's usually called a United Methodist Church, and that's because they reconciled their differences. Yeah, I can't remember what year, but significantly after the Civil War, but they reconciled their differences and became a United Methodist Church. The Baptists never did. The Southern Baptist Convention, largest Protestant denomination in America, the Northern Baptists became the American Baptists. And then, of course, trust me, there's plenty of other Baptists.
Now, American Baptists, you mean because of the fact that they were anti-slavery prior to the Civil War, or
that was what they broke up over.
Okay.
I want to say 1840.
Okay.
Was the split, and it really came to the point that the Baptists, as a group, were one body.
Mm-hmm.
Not all Baptists. You can never say anything about all Baptists.
Yeah. You could say that same for pretty much any religion, but
yeah. But one of their big things was sending missionaries to other countries. One of the things what's become the Northern Baptists do, or want to do, that the South does not accept, is they don't want any missionary going overseas with slaves. They think it sends a horrible message, especially for missionaries they're sending to Africa.
Right.
It just doesn't. It doesn't. The optics are not good.
Well, especially if you're going to a nation or a continent that has been through the ringer, literally through the ringer with the slave trade. You don't want them to be being brought back over.
Regardless of whether black nations had slaves or not, whether they sold slaves or not, really not the issue as far as the Northern Baptists are concerned.
Right.
Their concern is, how do you spread the gospel of Jesus when you're literally carrying around people that you've enslaved who are supposedly also Christians? It doesn't. It would be very hard to see why anybody would want to become a Christian if all you're going to do is slap irons on them.
I can totally understand why, and that's the deal. When again, we talked about this in one of the previous episodes. We talked about how Christians were not considered to be slaves. They were once they were baptized as Christian, even though they may have been from Africa, coming from Sierra Leone or Ghana or the Gold Coast or wherever the case may be, they were baptized as a Christian once they got off that boat, and they were called an indentured servant. So again, we of course, white males don't want to present that as a negative.
No, it's not. I mean, it's not a shining moment for white males, Christians, Americans. I mean, it's not. It's just not.
Right.
It's a hideous piece of history, but the problem is it's a piece of history that shapes the world we live in today. And the abolitionists, those northern people, for the vast majority, also a very large group of them in England.
Right.
James Wilberforce, and I can't think of the guy's name at that time, but they were very instrumental in getting the British Parliament to end slavery in England.
Which
it didn't end in the colonies for quite some time.
Right. Because England theoretically ended its slave trade.
Well, Great Britain, I'm sorry.
Great Britain, you're right. Great Britain ended its slave trade in 1822.
Sounds right.
I think that's about the time it was. But again, that's almost 12, 15 years after the U.S. Congress did.
Well, yeah.
In theory, we will say that in theory, because still there were slaves being brought into South Carolina. Not as on a regular basis as it was prior to 1800, but
not technically legally. So
right,
and of course you can't ever blame a country. Wait, I mean, you can't. But very rarely can you effectively blame a country for people who break its laws.
If that would be the case, we would have a lot of countries.
We would have a lot
some
of
negative
countries
stuff.
would be in really bad shape. But you can't judge a country by its the people that it's trying to stop, even if it fails to. I mean. There's a ton of examples for that, but you see this tension.
Right.
The South is doubling down on their commitment to black slavery, especially in those deep South states, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, that are heavily cotton. Because that cotton gin, I can't remember what the multiplier was.
Oh, it
took so long to get the seeds out of cotton by hand. It
would take one slave. 8 hours, 12 hours a day to get maybe 100 pounds of cotton. With the cotton gin, it would increase that by one group of slaves. So maybe one or two persons working the cotton gin, you could get almost 500, 600, 700 pounds of cotton in a day, which...
Right, anything that multiplies your productivity by 700% is going to be something that people latch on to.
Oh, of course.
And of course, Eli Whitney, he invented interchangeable parts, which made weapons. You could have a hammer that worked on every gun in that series, barrels that could be interchanged. It made armies so much more efficient because they all had the same caliber weapon.
And that's the thing. And that's the thing people may not understand. Eli Whitney was not trying to save the cotton industry.
No, that was not his goal.
That was not his goal by any means. But what he does, by proxy, ultimately makes this institution the peculiar institution that we talked about with slavery. That is why it is what it is, and how we remember it in the history books.
Yes.
Wasn't Eli Whitney a Northerner even?
Yes, he was a Northerner, and I think, and I've read somewhere, and this would be a hard one to quote where I found it, but that his hope for the cotton gin was that it would make it so profitable to do it that it could be used with hired labor. So if you could produce 700 pounds of cotton in a day, you could hire someone to do that, and then it would get rid of the need for slavery. Well, the Southerners always, we talked about this last time too,
yes,
and the time before that. If you have a system, we talked about with immigration, why hire someone when you can buy a slave? That's Southern thinking in this time period. And they look at the cotton gin and it's like, oh my goodness, I can now plant hundreds of acres in cotton and get it harvested and processed. And England and France and Northern America, for that matter, the textile industry is really kicking off. The demand of the factories is huge because their production has increased 1,000%.
Right.
And how much cloth they can make out of raw material. these Southerners, you could just probably see the dollar signs pop up in their eyes.
It's like those old cartoons
Yes.
that you saw in the the 60s and 70s,
Yeah.
where literally you'd be yes, exactly, their eyes be bugging out and there'd be saliva just running out of their mouths because they're just like, oh my God, so much money.
Yes, and it created a ton of wealth.
Exactly.
Because it created these giant plantations, which have become I guess, for lack of a better term, the symbol of antebellum South,
Right.
the plantation mansion.
Right.
I don't know. I know some of them were built earlier. Mount Vernon was
Yes.
earlier, but as far as plantations go, Mount Vernon's not very big.
No, it's not your. It's not like your mega church of today. For
It's not
instance.
Tara.
No, right, right. It's like think about it. If you think about it in terms of today's real estate market,
Oh yeah.
I mean, most Hollywood actors in the late 1800s, early 1900s, they weren't living in lavish mansions on top of the Hollywood Hills. They were in typical.
Well, before the invention of movies, they were traveling, living
Right.
in hotels, on
Right.
trains, moving from town to town, putting on plays.
Right.
The motion pictures begin, and suddenly the ability to reach a big audience is different. And cotton works the same way.
Right.
The ability to suddenly meet the demand of all these factories in England and France and Ireland and England.
And here's
or
another
America.
thing. And here's another thing that we talked about last time. We mentioned this briefly, but again, using the rivers and going into now your northern states, using those canals.
Yes.
And you're taking all of these cotton producing states, Alabama, southern Mississippi, Georgia, the Delta region, pretty much.
Yes.
And you're making that a profitable area for people both in the South, your traders along those major highways, the arteries, really the rivers of America at the time, and then your northern textile owners.
Yes.
And again, this is not just in terms of negatives of the South either.
No.
We see a large immigration population coming in from the parts of not America.
Ireland and Germany mostly. In the
Right.
early
Ireland in the mid 1800s, well, the 1840s, 1850s. Germany around that same time. But again, those are two different areas of people and two different groups where they settle too. But most of those Irish are being treated just a notch above your black slave in those factory systems.
And because in a lot of these places there are not a lot of blacks around, they're treated worse.
Right.
Because people, no Irish need apply.
Right.
Signs go up and things like that. A big difference is the Germans who came, for the vast majority, were craftsmen, people with skills.
Yes.
They might set up their own shop.
Right.
Silversmiths, blacksmiths,
Brewers.
brewers by the ton. I mean, if
Yes.
you go over to St. Louis
Oh my
and
gosh.
go through the Budweiser tour, that's
That's
their thing.
it's like a second Frankfurt.
Oh, it is. I mean, they just found such an open spot, and then of course, with more German immigration, they had an open audience,
Right.
that would come and want their beer. And so, you don't see the Germans being treated the same way because, well, for two reasons. A lot of the Germans are Protestant,
Yeah.
which America was heavily Protestant. Catholics were
Irish
very
being Catholic.
but then Irish are Catholic, and that's not well thought of.
No.
I mean, that issue of Catholics in America keeps going all the way till the election of John F. Kennedy.
Yes.
I actually know of a Baptist church that split over the people who thought that John F. Kennedy was going to sell us out to the Pope.
Oh my gosh.
So when you read your newspapers and watch your televisions and see people with these crazy, what we call, I guess, conspiracy theories, that we are not the first generation. We are not the first generation.
You mean to tell me Area 51 is not the first conspiracy theory ever? Oh my gosh.
Oh gosh, they've been around forever, and it's, so we see a different type of immigration, but those Irish,
Right.
we talked about them on the railroad, dying in droves, building the railroads across northern America, but we see the same thing in the factories.
Right.
Irish usually they're coming off small farms, they don't have a lot of craft skills. Yeah, a typical farmer would probably be able to fix, do basic carpentry and stuff
Right.
like that, but that's not a high demand job.
Maybe fix his wagon that he's using on his farm, or
Right.
help to fix the barn if there's a problem with the roof or something. But you're not looking at it in like a German style work ethic, that
Yeah,
Protestant work ethic.
Yeah, and so the Germans fit in that way too. Even a lot of Germans are Catholic,
Yes.
especially coming from Bavaria and the southern parts. They still have that same work ethic imbued into them, that this is where we're going to come to make ourselves wealthy.
Well,
And wealthy might just be our own land, our own shop, where we couldn't do that at home, because in a lot of German cities and states, the apprentice system was so onerous. It was almost like the indentured servant system. You would have to be an apprentice for sometimes decades before you could have your own shop, which meant you lived at a subsistence wage. You weren't able to get married. There's a whole lot of good stories about that, but that's a different topic.
Well, and again, here's another major difference. Irish were uneducated most of the time.
Very likely. Well, and their farms were very small, sometimes not even having animals.
Right.
They literally would plow the fields themselves.
Right. Whereas a German would come and settle in the Midwest region, or the old Northwest as we called it.
Well, obviously Wisconsin in a big way.
Oh my goodness. You go to anywhere in Wisconsin, and I mean,
maybe Northwest Missouri.
oh, right, yeah. But again, you go into these areas and they're considered Latin farmers because they read Latin books. They know languages beyond German or French or English, and most of the time they know English.
Yes, or
proficiently.
or at least enough to get through a work day.
To get through and to make a living and learn on the fly.
Well, and to assimilate.
Right.
Really, I mean, for lack of any other term, assimilation is what they were good at. They melded into society in every fashion, at every level, so that by the time we reached the First World War, there isn't, other than the changing of names of things, there isn't this large outlash, or in the Second World War as well.
Right.
There isn't this big backlash against Germans because everybody around you is part German.
Or they I don't know, it's kind of hard to determine a person by just looking at them.
Yeah,
that they're German.
Germans look a lot like the French, who look a lot like the Austrians and Danish, and
You can definitely tell the difference between a white man and a black man. And we'll get to that later on when we get into kind of that post-Civil War.
Yes.
Where there is going to be a little bit of confusion. There will be some changes going on, especially within how much black is black.
Right, yeah.
How much black blood is considered to be a black person. But again, that's a story for later on.
Yeah, we'll get to that maybe next week or
maybe
later.
Who knows? But one thing we do need to focus on, and we're kind of going down that rabbit hole, but it all kind of works together because most of those Protestants, like we talked about in the beginning, are from that northern portion, places like here in northern New York and in Pennsylvania, that are wanting change. And they want to change this idea of slavery, and they want to change this idea of gradual emancipation.
Yes. Well, and I guess to bring us back, like you say, that into the fight against slavery and emancipation, for emancipation, when we look at the Irish and the Germans, they come to America with a different understanding of what America should be.
That's a good point.
They are coming on the promise that they are free for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That is out everywhere. That is something they're, yes, they want to get wealthy. That's their pursuit of happiness.
Well, sure.
And what's wealthy? Well, compared to a poor sharecropping potato farmer from, the middle of Ireland, his own farm that barely makes a living is a castle.
Oh, for sure.
But his ultimate goal is he is free to choose that.
Yes.
He is free to do that.
Right.
And that freedom idea logically extends. When you see a black person, and of course Irish would have little to no experience with seeing black people, except if they lived in maybe Dublin,
Right.
Where the English were very strong.
Yes.
You would have this the thought process isn't a very far leap, that they should be free as well.
Right.
There's no reason that blacks couldn't be free.
Everyone should be free in the eyes of these immigrants.
Exactly.
Because again, they're being oppressed.
And they're coming from countries that have oppression that we can't understand.
No, of course not.
The Irish living under a system of British landlords. Those landlords may never have even been there. They hired other Irish to be trustees for the prison term, to run their farms, and they sold cash crops, or they sold food to England in the middle of this potato famine, where the main crop that the Irish ate is dying in the fields, and they're starving, literally starving to death in a lot of places. And so the idea of coming and having a place that, even if it's just a tent on a piece of land, and you're able to farm something and have excess, and then maybe next year you put up a shack, and then next year you actually add a room, and then maybe you have a indoor kitchen, suddenly you're living the dream. And we have a hard time thinking about that because we come from a very wealthy society where even our poor people have quite a bit of things compared to third world countries. And these immigrants have nothing. And the Germans, even though they're more skilled, they're coming from a system that doesn't allow them to get paid for their skill. It doesn't allow them to vote for anything. And Germany was still really working in a lot of places under the rule that came out with the Treaty of Westphalia. Whoever the prince was, that's the religion. So if you're living in, say, Wittenberg, and the new prince comes in and he's Catholic and you're a Protestant, well, guess what? You can't go to church anymore. And you have to pay taxes to a Catholic church and tithes. And people come here so they don't have to do that. And that's, of course, we'll talk about religious toleration in a completely different episode. But that's a huge part of what freedom looks like to these people, because they don't have even the freedom in a lot of their places to even worship openly. They're not capable of that. No. Not allowed to do that. I shouldn't say capable.
This is also the time frame we're focused on is also around the same time as that Second Great Awakening.
Yes.
Which, if you may or may not remember from your history books, but the Second Great Awakening is one that is predominantly American style.
Yes. Yes. The first one was kind of English led.
Right. And that's really kind of opening up that sense of just being free in your religious toleration. But now the Second Great Awakening, you're getting into places like, again, the Burned Over District, which is in that northern portion of New York State, right there along the Erie Canal area, which of course is saying, going along with that idea of the immigrants, we want everyone to be free. We want everyone to be considered a citizen, if not a citizen, at least have that option.
That, if our founding documents are inspired at all by the concept of the Christian faith, then the Christian faith should apply to all people who are considered able to be saved, which would be anyone you meet. Regardless of color, gender, it doesn't matter. And that Second Great Awakening, well, two movements spring out of it.
Yes, definitely. First, the abolitionist movement, and second of all, feminism.
First wave feminism, which is literally I want the right to actually own my own property, to be able to vote.
To be considered
a citizen.
And that's the thing. There are the 19th century America, really the 19th century world.
Well, Europe for sure.
For sure, the first world, parts of the colonies, not so much as heavy, but you start to find more of these anti-misogynistic females, where they're starting to grow. They're starting to develop their own thought process. You start to see, again, some of the first female colleges. You start to see some of those movements, again, the Seneca Falls movement, where we have women such as Susan B. Anthony and Harriet Beecher Stowe, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. The old generation of feminists,
which also included lots of men.
It
was not exclusively female domain to be advocating for women's rights.
Right, you have a large number of Protestant preachers.
Yes.
You have a large number of prominent business owners making it better for the female individual, which, again, this is something that is unheard of for the last, millennia.
Or three.
Yes, because women were tending to be the ones staying at home, working the hearth, keeping those children in line until they went to go and work or whatever the case may be. Women didn't see the grapes of their labors,
No.
the fruits of their labors.
Yeah, and again, that's really pushed by the Industrial Revolution.
Right.
So many women started, especially single women.
Mm-hmm.
They would live in dormitories with a mistress that kept them in line.
Gosh, yes.
But they would work in these factories because small fingers and large amounts of endurance, both of things that women have plenty of.
Right. Just working those small gears.
That small fine motor skills and the cloth and
Yes.
the string. In a textile factory, Massachusetts is built on women's labor, which of course is where these meetings start out.
Yes. That's right.
If women are going to be working and doing all this labor outside the home, they should be treated as if they are
Equal.
the same as any other homeowner or family leader.
Right.
And so many of them were.
Yes.
I mean, we don't live in the world where tons and tons of people die early. But 1815, you get an appendicitis, you might not make it.
You get the measles, or you
Well,
get
you get the
pneumonia.
measles, you don't die, but you're blind now.
Yeah.
How do you go feed your family as a man?
Right.
Means your wife's going to go out and work.
Right. You have to do it,
And if she's not treated equally, which means she's paid half the wage,
uh-huh.
that's not going to help you survive.
doing still the same number of hours,
Right.
which
You
is
might
the thing.
literally take her husband's place at the factory.
Yes.
And get paid less.
Yes, and that really brings up then this rise of this first wave feminism. But unfortunately, we have to say the caveat to it. With this rise of slavery, thanks to Eli Whitney and the cotton gin, we see now that feminist movement being pushed down, and not because they're being oppressed.
Because they volunteer.
They voluntarily moved out of the way.
And part of their reasoning, at least some of their reasoning, was that as long as black men were enslaved,
Right.
nobody was going to vote for white women to be free.
Exactly.
And so they, as a group, the large majority of the feminist movement at that time, moved their work from feminism to abolitionism.
Which, of course, nobody probably just sits around and reads their Constitution,
Yes.
like you and I might. But again, the Civil War amendments, or the Reconstruction Amendments, the Reconstruction Amendments, where you're looking at the 13th, 14th, and 15th. The 14th Amendment says, the 15th Amendment, that says all male citizens shall have the right to vote,
Right.
with no exception of their color, race, creed, or national origin. Does it say anything about females? No, of course not. Because again,
That debate had not been settled by
No.
a long shot.
and again, we see it that they don't want that to be the problem yet. There are
Right.
bigger fish to fry.
Well, yeah, there's a growing problem in the South as the 1830s and 40s progress. We talked about the Senate as that place where the battleground is really faced in politics.
Right.
At that point, it stays even, really, until
Yes.
you get into the 1840s,
Oh my
late
gosh.
1840s, 1850s, really. The pendulum swings heavily towards the free states.
Right.
With the West Coast edition, basically.
Right. Because you have here California becoming a state in 1850.
Right.
Which then opens up that compromise of 1850, which stated in the compromise of 1850 that with California's entrance into the Union as a free state, the slave states or the southern states will have a harsher fugitive slave law And I don't know, was there anything else? I don't believe there was anything.
It opened up Utah.
Right, opened up
Which is
Utah.
farther north than it should have been.
That's true, right. But the deal is with that fugitive slave law, anybody here in this territory of the North is now a bounty hunter.
Yeah, for all intents and purposes, you're right. A bounty. That's a good phrase for it.
And these slave owners were allowed to go up into the North and take people who they thought were rightfully their own.
Isn't that 12 Years a Slave?
12 Years a Slave, Solomon Northup. If you haven't seen that, parental guidance suggested, please.
Yes.
There are some scenes in that film that are intended for adult
Probably wouldn't
audiences.
show this even in a high school setting.
You're right. It is very touchy on the subject, but the idea is that it was ultimately that fugitive slave law, that a black man living in the North, he was actually from he lived in Saratoga.
Which isn't even close to the South.
No.
It's not like he was living just over the Pennsylvania line.
No, he was up in northern New York, close to the Canada border.
Yeah.
Closer to the Canada border than he would be for the southern Mason-Dixon line.
Oh, yeah.
But they took him. White individuals took him, sold him into slavery, and he was spent 12 years, obviously hence the name 12 Years a Slave, under enslavement, never had been on a plantation in his life, was born a free man, but because he was black.
Didn't he have a trade?
He was a musician.
Okay, so.
And I believe he might have also been a carpenter by trade as well. But I know he was a musician. He was a traveling violinist.
So, if for that day, that would not have been considered a trade.
Not necessarily, but
And well, like we just talked about just a couple minutes ago, actors.
Right.
Musicians were the same way. Without
Right.
a mass audience, they spent their lives on the road, going from town to town, playing wherever they could for whatever money they could make. Word of mouth was their only hope because they didn't have, agents and publicists out there getting their advertising out.
Of course not.
And so he's always a stranger.
Right.
Which is why, because you would think, oh my gosh, if you had a violinist in your town, regardless of their color, the concept of people would come and drag him off in the middle of the night, or actually in the middle of the day.
Yes.
And nobody'd say anything. It's because he doesn't belong to them. He's other.
Right.
And that other, I don't want to go to that big other that we've been talking about, how other people have been seen.
Yes.
But it's the same kind of other in any small town that, if you go there and you move in, you're always going to be the new person until you've been there 30 or 40 years.
Yes. Maybe you've had kids who then have kids.
Yeah,
and,
right.
And they're in that same neighborhood.
You're not running off anytime
Right.
soon.
You put your roots down.
And so, it's just a weird way to think about that.
Yes.
But then again, we're also talking about a world with a whole lot less law enforcement.
Oh my gosh. Just the idea of having a local sheriff would be a stretch.
Well, most of them would be part-time.
Right.
They'd be working their own farm or their own business. And so police work was
second
fiddle at best because it didn't pay well.
No.
I guess you could really hope if you could get somebody with a bounty on their head.
Yeah.
That accidentally stayed at your inn or tavern. But that was a lifetime once in a lifetime kind of thing.
Yes.
So it's just a weird to think about. But so we have these two big tensions. This abolition movement that's growing stronger and stronger.
Oh my gosh, yes.
In the North, and at the same time, the Supreme Court, Congress, because it's split, makes this compromise that opens up the North. Whereas a person who's living in, say, northern Ohio, Cleveland, they're living and working in Cleveland. They're probably at that time 1 or 2% of the city might have been black,
if you're lucky.
and so
not many
they exist, but you don't really know them. And if you're an abolitionist, which a lot of people were,
especially in the old Northwest,
the people you were looking at were free people, and they thought other people should be free as well. With this compromise and the laws that went into effect because of it, suddenly, if a new black person shows up, you're supposed to be watching out to see if they're an escaped slave. What's the difference between an escaped slave to, say, somebody from Cleveland, an escaped slave, and someone who was given their freedom when their master died and moved north because you can't live in the South as a free black?
there's no difference to them.
Right, you'd
There is no difference.
have probably wrist scars or back
Yeah.
scars from whipping, because, I have a hard time imagining that most black men could make it through their teenage years without at least one whipping.
Oh my gosh.
Because I know I couldn't have.
No,
Not a chance.
not a chance. No.
I didn't get through without a whipping myself.
I will say this: I was a back talker. You
You would have been in trouble.
You could talk to my parents about that. I was definitely that back talker, and I was very the yes sir and the negative yes sir. Kiss my butt. I don't care. But again, if you were to ever do anything like, even if you weren't trying to be sarcastic or anything, a master could have whipped you just because he wanted to.
Well, not enough cotton this year.
Yeah, oh my gosh, not enough cotton picked in a day.
It doesn't matter that the boll weevils were there.
Yeah.
We have less cotton than we had last year. It's your fault.
Yep,
Pick 3 people and we'll whip them.
yep.
We're
Get them
gonna
out there.
motivate these people.
Yeah, which brings us into the next point. Now with more abolitionists, you start to see more and more sympathizers in the North. And one particular sympathizer that comes to mind in my individual learning is Harry Beecher Stowe.
Oh, well, yeah, Uncle Tom's Cabin,
Which
is an anti-slavery novel, basically.
yeah,
It's similar to The Jungle later.
It's written in a serial version, meaning that it was in small sections
In
and then
a magazine,
yeah,
right?
in a
Harper's?
magazine. I think it was Harper's Weekly. I couldn't quite
Can't
remember
remember that.
exactly that, but people would be reading it on a weekly basis to see what happens next.
Yeah.
And then eventually they combine it into the novel that we know of today. But
Right.
but here's the deal. Harry Beecher Stowe,
That was Garrison, wasn't it?
William Lloyd Garrison.
Yeah, it was the
Mhm.
newspaper guy who was very much abolitionist.
The Liberator.
The Liberator was his paper, yeah.
He was in Alton, Illinois. Eventually, he actually gets killed in Alton, which is very close to St. Louis. Kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Because St. Louis was such a free area in a very slave state of Missouri.
Yes.
But again, with Harry Beecher Stowe, William Lloyd Garrison, not William Lloyd Garrison, who did I say? I don't know.
I don't know.
Scratch that, we blinked.
I blinked between then and now.
But the idea of Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, here's the deal: she was never in the South.
Ever.
The closest she's ever got to a plantation would be in Kentucky, because she spent a few weeks or a month or so in Cincinnati, which is just over the Ohio River from Kentucky. Oh my gosh, you would not see the same thing in Kentucky, Louisville, as you would
In Alabama.
Mobile, Alabama, or
Tennessee,
or even in central or western Tennessee. It just the things she learned and presented in her book were from stories she heard.
Stories she heard, people she talked to.
Right.
But the Civil War has the Red Badge of Courage, same thing.
Yeah.
He never served a day.
Right.
But he wrote a book that captured the fear and the chaos in a way that even veterans said was realistic.
Right.
Which is an amazing feat
Yes.
for an author. Stephen Crane.
Yes.
But we have this push, not just for the abolitionists, those dedicated groups of people who were actively working and created the Underground Railroad.
Right.
That people would smuggle people out of the South. If they could get to the right farm,
Yes.
they might literally have a tunnel and go underground, or they might just have a wagon or a boat that went across the Ohio River to
Right.
get them to freedom. Secretary of State Seward,
Yeah.
famous for the Alaska Purchase, Seward's
Yes.
Folly.
Yes.
He's
1867.
been laughing for quite a while about that.
Yep.
As soon as they hit gold, I think he was pretty much in charge of winning that one.
Yep.
But I think he was dead by then, so I don't know if
From
he
a
ever got to enjoy that "I told you so" moment.
Yeah. Unfortunately, he was laughing in his grave.
Yes,
But
his children could laugh.
yes.
So we have quite a few prominent people who are active in organizing this Underground Railroad, that
Of course.
trying to free a trickle. Really, it's only. I mean, it's kind of like reading about the resistance in France.
Yes.
It sounds great for movies, but the reality was it had a very minor part in the war.
right.
In the South, the Underground Railroad, it was probably more worthwhile as a propaganda method with the Liberator
Yes.
and things like that, publicized in the North, the conditions that these slaves were escaping
Right.
from, the things that they would do to pursue, the dogs and,
Oh, yes.
rock salt shotguns
Mhm.
and things like that, that would absolutely horrify, well, not just horrify, but sound very familiar to this Irish audience
Right.
who come from a land where an English landlord might shoot an
Mhm.
Irish person
Just because.
because they could, because he was out hunting one day and he decided you want to shoot, see what
Right.
happened. And there wouldn't be any repercussions because it's Ireland.
Right.
He's just a Catholic. He says Irish. Who
He's
cares?
just he's an Irish Catholic who's on my land.
Yes, and it doesn't care that he works for me.
And again,
I'll get another one.
it doesn't. It is the
It's
same.
that same other that is
Yes.
less than mentality
Yes.
that these Irish would wildly. And the weird part is, if you see in Boston, if you see the movie Glory, they
Oh my
talk about the
gosh.
fact that they hire an Irish sergeant major to teach them how to march. And one of the officers comments, the Irish aren't known for their love of the colored, as they were called at the time.
Yeah.
Because when you go to the north, New York especially,
Mm-hmm.
the Irish and the blacks are competing for the same jobs.
Well, of course.
and so there's more animosity between them than anybody else because of
Yes.
the fact they're always fighting for that same job.
Yes, and I mean that happens even before the Civil War.
Oh, yes. Well
I mean, once you
Yes.
really do see those influx of well, I guess emancipated peoples,
Yeah.
the blacks coming from Virginia or Kentucky, and they're coming into again New York or Pennsylvania, and they're just thinking, well, I'm a cheap laborer. No. You're gonna have to compete with the rest of them. You're gonna have to be competing with these Irish, and they are not ones to give up.
No,
And in
because-
fact, they go fisticuffs with these blacks.
Well, the Irish gangs
Yes,
start very early,
they do.
which of course is a very common story for immigration groups,
Uh-huh.
is they stick
Stick
together,
together.
because it's the only place you can go to get the food you like,
Right.
hear the people
Mm-hmm.
that sound like you,
Yep.
and worship the way you do.
Right.
It's a huge factor for a lot of people that probably weren't religious in Ireland, but the church becomes a very central portion of their life, which grows the Catholic Church in America in a lot of ways that we'll probably talk about in a different episode. But Catholic education becomes so important because this is the same time period that Sunday schools begin.
Sure.
And Sunday schools weren't originally to teach you the Bible. That was a secondary effect. The
Yeah.
first effect was to teach you to read and write,
Right.
so you could read your own Bible.
Right.
Um,
But again,
which was, again, for the Irish of the time, the German, even a lot of the Germans, and then later in the century, Poles
Mm-hmm.
And Russians, and those Eastern Slavs that had
Oh my
even less
gosh.
education than the
Yes.
Irish,
Oh my.
they come and that becomes that foundational point of their life. Well, why would you ever leave a church that's helped you so much?
Exactly.
It helped you learn to read and write, it got you a job, or at least temporary jobs
Something.
to make things until you can find a good job.
If
It
you
was a big deal, and it was always tied to your neighborhood.
Yes.
It was always a neighborhood church
Mhm.
or parish if you're
Right.
Catholic,
right.
and it's wildly important. But you have this constant thing. At one hand, you have Irish believing that blacks should be free, but at the same time, that doesn't mean they're not going to get in a brawl.
Oh, no.
because
Oh, my gosh,
they're
no.
fighting for a contract over unloading a ship.
Yes, exactly. And if they don't get that contract, then their families starve.
Yeah.
Or they get evicted from their slum. God help them, even if they wanted to. They
Oh.
couldn't move up. Those slums were just terrible. We'll again
Oh.
get to that when we get closer
We'll
to
talk
the
industrialization
Yes, when we get into the
urbanization.
late 1800s, early 1900s, and that
Oh,
is
yeah.
just a terrible time. But the idea, of course, is now these abolitionist movements. They start to spread. They come into places, again, this unorganized territory. Again, there's this huge chunk of what is the Louisiana Purchase that is not developed at all. And so that brings up now another, as we like to say in our government, compromise.
Yep.
The Compromise of 1854,
Right.
which of course opens up this Kansas and Nebraska territory.
And permanently switches the balance of power in the
Yes.
Senate.
Yes.
Because now California's come in, Minnesota comes in
Uh-huh.
sometime in that same
Around that
frame.
same time.
And then eventually Kansas is working towards statehood and with a very aggressive
Yes.
abolitionist core. The Jayhawkers were notoriously anti-slavery.
But you got to keep in mind what is on that eastern border of Kansas. Missouri.
And we're sitting right smack dab in the middle of bleeding Kansas.
My goodness, 1854 is when it started, and it was worldwide nation. It was worldwide headlines.
This line here for Western Missouri, for those of you in Missouri, used to be straight up.
Yes.
This whole angle that follows the Missouri River was Kansas.
Technically, it was
Well, part of the disorganized territory /
Right.
Kansas territory eventually when they incorporate.
And then a man by the name of Platt.
Right.
I believe he was either a state senator, he was either a business owner or a state senator from the state of Missouri. He decided, hey, we can get some valuable land
Oh, river bottom land.
in
Good
this
stuff.
area. And you got to think about it. Kansas City is right there.
Yep. Right,
On
right.
the very edge of that Platt Purchase. Now, that was the edge of the slave statehood, I guess you should say.
Yeah.
But after that Platt Purchase is taken over, let me back up a little bit and get rid of some of that big circle in Missouri. Come on.
Too much Madden.
I know, right? Anyway, gosh, getting through, yeah, get rid of that. Okay, so as you'll see here, again, once you have Kansas City be established, that was around 1848, 1849, I believe, is when it was officially established. You then have this creation here of that Platt Purchase that opens up 5 more counties, upwards to about
Platte,
Buchanan, Andrew, Nottoway, Holt. Yeah, Holt County.
Yeah.
So those 5 counties in northwest Missouri, if you're from any of those areas or live in any of those areas today, you may know some of that history and the idea that, again, we were staunch slave owners.
Well, I mean, here in St. Joe, Frederick Avenue, out when you get out past, really past about 28th Street, you start seeing these bigger homes, plantation-style homes.
Yes.
Of course, tobacco was big in this area.
Right.
I mean, down in Weston, it's still a cash crop.
It is.
So just south of us.
And then when you get into Parkville, that was a huge port city along the Missouri River.
Yeah, well, Weston was a port, had a port. And so, of course, St. Joseph had already been here for a while as a trading city, or trading place, not a city by any stretch. But it was growing rapidly. Kansas City was pretty much Denata. Independence was the big town at that time.
Yes. That was with the westward migration, and again, something that we'll talk about later on. But that was the starting point, because beforehand, none of this out west, none of that was really even there. No one was there.
Right, with Great American Desert.
Yeah, exactly. So getting to the point here now of the of that compromise of 1854, we see now roughly right about there. And this would have been Kansas, and this would have been the Nebraska territory.
Right.
Okay, and there's one particular reason for it, and it all is about the dinero. Money, money, money. And it comes down to the idea of a man by the name of Stephen Douglas. He's a little giant, as they kind of call him, because he was a little short. But he is the senator here from Illinois. And he is a business owner. He wants to make more money for his business. And so he is based out of here in Chicago. Well, he wanted to have a railroad that went from Chicago out here to San Francisco. But again, this unorganized territory was the problem. Nobody was there, no land could be taken from the government to operate in that railroad.
Yes.
They actually had a transcontinental railroad put in place that was going to cross here, the south, and it was going to go across the state of Texas, and by 1850, as you see here, New Mexico is already established as a territory. Government could have taken it, right? So they were going to take it and put it all the way down here in Los Angeles, San Diego area, but again, Stephen Douglas, being that great compromiser, opens up Kansas and Nebraska to one particular thing: popular sovereignty. Which popular sovereignty literally just means
whoever lives there gets to vote.
Exactly.
And it's a wildly popular idea.
Yeah.
Even for people who live in Massachusetts, they hear that, and that sounds
yes.
exactly like you want to hear. We hear that repeated, by the way,
Mm-hmm.
in Woodrow Wilson's 14 Points.
Yes.
Because that was one of his things.
Yes.
Nations should be able to create themselves. In this case, in America, states should be able to
Right.
create themselves.
Right.
I don't think Stephen Douglas would have been pleased by the idea of Nebraska being a foreign country.
No, I don't think so either.
That
But
would not have been what he meant by popular sovereignty.
no, his idea was when it came to slave and free, what the voters of the state say is what it will be. So, like what we were getting ready to talk about, you have a large number of people coming from Missouri over to Kansas.
Yes.
You're having people come over from Iowa into Kansas, Illinois into Kansas, Massachusetts into Kansas.
Jayhawkers.
Yes. And of course against the Missouri Tigers.
There you go.
Again,
It's gonna be a fight.
Many of your college mascots came out of the Civil War.
Yes.
Auburn Tigers, again Missouri Tigers, Kansas Jayhawkers,
The Hawkeyes.
the Hawkeyes.
Of Iowa.
Yeah. You've got a large number of others, like maybe not so much in the Old Northwest, but definitely like in your Midwestern region.
Yes.
Especially.
Well, that's when even though Missouri was 1821,
Yes.
it was tied up with slavery.
Of course.
And its identity
Oh
is
my.
with the whole struggle, north,
Yes.
south. St. Joe Museum here in St. Joe used to have a really great map
Mhm.
that they had up. Last time I went, I didn't see it, but it had the state broken up into districts,
Mhm.
and it had little flags for where the support was.
Yes.
And the state was almost completely flipped upside down.
Yes.
Most Confederate people were up here in Bleeding, Kansas, and in the north, where you had this wide open prairie,
Right.
where you could recreate the plantations of the South.
Right.
Whereas the southern part of the state, of course, is
Not so much mountains, but it's hilly.
rough hills.
Yes.
And so it meant smaller family farm, craftsmen, loggers,
Right.
people who didn't use slavery as much. And so you see less support for the Confederacy in the deep South than you do in the North,
Mhm.
which it was always one of those cognitive dissonances for me when I go see that map. It just seemed so backwards. Why is the North more popular in the South of Missouri?
Yeah.
Until you, of course, you start learning about economics and
Right.
demographics, and
It makes sense then.
and that's a nice map. But the story is that Missouri was wildly mingled. The history
Yes.
of St. Joseph is filled with conflict throughout that entire
Oh my
period.
gosh, yes.
Mayors running up Confederate flags and then getting run out of town. I know the church that I preached out down south of here in Camden Point, one of their pastors before the Civil War in Bleeding, Kansas,
Mm-hmm.
was very abolitionist, and he ended up dead.
Oh my gosh.
Another one north of here got tarred and feathered.
Right, and
Um,
it's just an amazing little snippet of history in this state.
Well, it's hard to dig up. I grew up here. I went to school here.
Yeah,
And I never heard of Bleeding, Kansas until I went to school in Texas.
seriously.
Seriously, never heard the word mentioned.
Well, then again,
I had no idea what they were talking about.
I guess when I was in high school, I did take a Civil War history class, so that does
That would have
make
been a
it.
big help.
That would have made it a lot different.
Because to be honest, my history classes went like with most history classes I took in college as well. You did part one of American history, went from 1492
Mm-hmm.
to about 1830, because you ran out of time.
Right.
And then the next course started 1866 with Reconstruction and went to not quite the Civil War, or the World War II.
Right. Well,
so
you just couldn't.
never really got much on the Civil War.
And
It was a difficult, and of course, it was the 70s. Missouri was still a pretty, it was a blue state.
It
then.
was.
It was very democratic.
Yes.
And very old school democratic.
Right.
Truman was kind of an outlier in the Democratic Party as far as his social views.
Oh my gosh, yes.
But it's a different world, and it doesn't make a lot of sense to us who grew up now, where the issues that formulate groups have changed dramatically.
Definitely.
But Missouri, probably of all the border states, was the most conflicted.
Yes.
Kentucky was always a southern state in its mentality,
Right.
but it didn't secede.
No. And
Maryland couldn't secede.
Right.
Because, well,
The District of Columbia was
District
right
of
in
Columbia is
there.
right in the middle of it. And I think the people in Maryland realized that if they took a side, especially if they took a side for the South, basically the population of Pennsylvania was going to land on them with both feet.
Yes. There was no way in heck they would
Well,
be able to
there's
get
no
out.
defensible border
Right.
between them and Pennsylvania,
You're right.
whereas you have the Potomac separating you from Virginia. So I think Maryland probably chose the wiser course,
Yes.
even though they probably saw themselves as more southern than northern.
And Delaware's just
But
there.
today you would see them as a mid-Atlantic state. They don't
Right.
really have much in common with southern states.
No.
So things change.
Right.
Uh,
But the thing
So 1854,
Right.
compromise that.
1854, we have now the Kansas-Nebraska Act that establishes now two separate territories. Kansas, which was supposed to have, again, that popular sovereignty. We don't see much of any problem in Nebraska, which is an
No.
interesting thing. Nebraska, again, they're bordered by both sides. If you look at it here, the Minnesota Territory, Iowa, which again, Minnesota was still under that Missouri Compromise, so they would have had to have been north
A free
of
state.
that and be a free state. Oregon was the same way, and that of course leads out into Idaho and Montana and other places out here in the Mountain West region. But again, with that Kansas-Nebraska Act, it repealed the Missouri Compromise line.
Yes.
So
the
it
line is
ultimately,
no longer, well,
Right,
it
it's
already
not
been
a
partially
factor.
repealed
Right.
because of the 1850 compromise,
Yes.
which allowed them to go slaves up into the Utah territory.
but it is officially done for, not ever to be used again.
Right.
It does not go past go and collect $200, okay?
It's done.
It is done, and how we will now find out is here again when you see large groups of Southerners coming from places like Arkansas or Tennessee, Missouri, most of them, of course, being the border of Missouri and Kansas, coming just right over the border. But you'll also find people from the Northeast, New York, those revived Protestant revolutionaries, if you will.
Well, they're definitely on fire.
Yeah, they are. They are running toward Kansas like a man on fire.
To them, they are fulfilling the promise of the Revolution and the Declaration of Independence.
Exactly.
By being against slavery.
And one particular individual who is sitting in the back of a church, and he rises to the end of this congregation and says, "I vow till the end of my life to destroying slavery." His name was John Brown. He was a very important person.
Well, he's a spark.
He's
one of the sparks in the tinderbox for sure.
Oh my gosh, that is
Because-
definitely a great way of putting it. He was a failure at everything that he did, though.
Hey, be nice to failures. Truman failed at everything he did until he was president.
You're right. But unfortunately for John Brown, though, he was a failure at a farmer. He was
Yes.
a failure at a businessman. He was a failure when it came to the
Couldn't
preaching
keep it.
life. He couldn't keep anything really going his way.
Mm.
But what he was known for is something that we could probably never forget either, is the fact that he goes and he will hack up, not just murder, but literally disembowel and rip apart 4 pro-slavery supporters in what is Pottawatomie Creek, which is in south central Kansas, over on the southeastern side, kind of right around where now,
Fort Smith.
yeah, right around, just about north of Fort Smith and that area, or not, Fort Scott.
Fort Scott, sorry,
That's
yeah.
right. Fort
Wrong
Smith's
S.
in
Arkansas.
that's in Arkansas. Fort Scott. So in the Pittsburgh, Fort Scott area, he's just one night goes out, kills these 4 men, tosses them into the Pottawatomie Creek.
Because he knows that they are slavers.
Yes, he knows they are
Pro-slavery, and we buried them.
pro-slavery, and he wants them gone. He's making it a mission of his, that God has given him that right to, well, taking it back to that Constitution, taking it back to the revolutionary ideas. It's the God-given right as Americans to be free.
Right, and if they're here, they're Americans, and they should be free.
Exactly.
Even, I mean, I don't know any of John Brown's writings to speak. I don't know he wrote much.
Not much.
But I've known he might not have ever spoke to a black man, for as far as I know.
Honestly, before the Harper's Ferry raid in 1857, he probably didn't.
And then, Harper's Ferry, but I guess kind of to back up, that tinderbox concept.
Yeah.
Slave rebellions were not unknown.
Oh, no.
They were usually very small.
Yes, they were.
And limited. And even the famous one, Nat Tyler.
Nat Turner.
Turner, sorry.
Right.
It was big news.
Yes.
Huge news.
Yes.
It was attitude changing is probably the most important thing.
For sure.
He started his little fight on a plantation. He killed 55 whites in an immediate area. And then the Virginia militia showed up, and a bunch of locals showed up and killed everybody that was involved, and probably a few others.
Right.
In the grand scheme of the population or the total amount of slaves,
it's a drop in the bucket.
It's a drop in the bucket. But it hits very strongly at the heart of Southerners that this is their biggest fear.
Yes.
This is the same idea of the Tate murders in Los Angeles put a run on mail order guns, which was a thing at the time.
Gosh!
People were ordering guns online because they were terrified.
Of course.
That people, the Tate murders are literally, somebody runs into your house, they don't know you, they just chose your house and decided to kill you and your family. Jeez. This is that Nat Turner concept. Somebody living in Alabama, far away from Virginia, they read that in their paper and their stomach is cold. Oh. They are terrified that this could happen to them, and suddenly the laws change.
Slaves can't be out without an escort after dark.
Right. Can't be taught to read and write now.
Right.
Permanently, because Nat Turner was taught by one of his owners to read and write. And they thought that, of course, all that book learning will get you.
Yeah. He read the Bible. He read the Bible, ladies and gentlemen. And he realized slavery is not a good thing.
Yes, because even where it's condoned in the Bible, it's regulated.
Right.
That there are limits to what you can do. There are limits that we would still find abhorrent, but when we talk ancient times, that's part of it.
Right.
And we mentioned this in our first episode about old world slavery. But when you get to New Testament especially, it's there because people were slaves. It's just the world they lived in.
Yes.
But it was very obvious that Christians should be above that.
Yes.
And so this isn't just a revolutionary calling for these abolitionists. This is literally calling by God.
Right.
And when we start talking about the Civil War in general, probably next week, this is going to be a huge factor for a lot of people of faith.
Of course.
In fact, it'll crush the Quakers.
Oh, yes, for sure. And again, that is a topic for next time.
Yeah,
but I think we've come to a great stopping point. We've covered quite a bit of territory.
A lot of territories.
Yes.
Kansas, Nebraska,
Nebraska, California becoming a state. We have mentioned quite a bit about this newly formed movement.
Yes, this abolition movement that's grown from a small group, really, of people who are just looking to make all people free.
Right.
Women first.
Right.
But then when they realize that there's a bigger problem,
they grow exponentially.
Unlike when they were growing up, a lot of these people are 40s and 50s. When they were growing up, slavery was on the downhill slide.
Yeah.
It was probably going to be gone in a generation or two, except for isolated groups.
Right.
And then the cotton gin. And so suddenly they live in a different world that they thought was going to be gone. And so now they have to shift their focus. And you have all this tension building up. And to me, the spark, the thing that just can't be avoided is the Dred Scott case.
You're right.
That decision that reinforced the fugitive slave laws that we talked about. That suddenly you're responsible as a Northerner to enforce slavery. It means now you can't ignore it.
Right.
Before you lived your life in Cleveland or Albany or
wherever
Boston or wherever you lived in the North, slavery didn't really have much effect on your life. It was somewhere far away.
Yes.
And you'd probably never go there. It didn't affect your life. And so you didn't. The fact that slavery existed might torment your soul. It might irritate you. Might vote against it. But then again, your senators were already voting against it anyway.
Yes.
But now you're part of it.
Because Roger Taney and Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, who again was from Maryland, mind you, a border state, but still going towards the south.
Thinking.
Yes. came right out and said three main things. First, the Constitution cannot determine whether or not a state can be free or slave. If it is not in the Constitution, then it shall not be removed from a state. So Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, all those northern states that have banned slavery, the Constitution did not ban slavery, so that meant that it is still legal there. Second of all,
which is an odd interpretation even for that time.
Yes, it is.
Because they were much more states' rights, and yet he is literally flipping that on its head and saying all those states that voted for it, it doesn't count.
Right.
Which is not going to make the people in the North happy.
No. Second of all, again, it brings in that idea that black individuals cannot sue in the courts. And thirdly, the main thing is black people are not even citizens.
Right. Which, I mean, that was
already something that was brought in
anyway.
there, but he solidified it in that case, said there.
Right.
Black individuals are not even human.
Right.
They're not even human in the eyes of the people of the United States.
Right. And again, that was even at the time, was a controversial rule of law.
Yes.
Would not have probably lasted more than a generation or two, assuming the Civil War doesn't intervene.
Right.
It would probably have changed, especially as expansion went westward, and the number of states in the Senate would have turned it over. Eventually, advice and consent would have changed the court.
Right.
But the thing is those people in the North who now felt like everything was blowing, the wind was all blowing in their direction. The Senate is changing. The new territories are going to be free. That means even more senators. Eventually, they'll be filibuster-proof, right? Maybe even eventually veto-proof, right? And they already have the House. That's already locked up.
Yeah, there's no doubt in there.
So, and then all of a sudden, here comes this Supreme Court justice, who, in a, for lack of a better term, a landmark ruling.
Yes.
Don't know where he got his precedents or concepts.
Gosh, yeah.
Because they're almost antithetical to his side.
Well, yes.
The idea of states' rights is paramount to the South.
Well, and that's the thing.
The fact that he would seek to invalidate states' rights in the North kind of shows you how partisan he was to the issue.
Right.
But it makes the people in the North feel disempowered.
Right.
And when people feel disempowered by the political process, violence does not follow too far behind. And Harper's Ferry is within, what, 2 years?
Months.
Maybe months, yeah.
Because the Dred Scott decision was in '57, and then Harper's Ferry was within about a month or two after.
That's true, that's right. I forgot they were so close in time.
Yes.
Of course, we have railroads, so we don't have to walk the whole way.
That's right.
From Kansas.
That's right.
But and that John Brown, that spark in the tinderbox, he didn't strike that spark himself.
No.
He was the tinder.
Yes.
That decision, I think, made Civil War irreversible.
Without a doubt.
There was not a political solution at this point.
Right. There was nothing else that could.
Because no one in the North, they've just been invalid. Their entire structure of law had been invalidated because the Constitution didn't say anything specific about slavery other than they only counted as 3/5 for voting. That's the only thing the Constitution mentions, which I guess in Tawny's opinion would mean that slavery had to exist.
Yes.
Maybe that's where he got his idea. I can't say that I've delved too deeply into his opinion because I don't hold a lot with it.
I wouldn't either. I wouldn't either. He in grand scheme of things, he's kind of like a blip in a radar screen. Well, because he came onto the scene, he had no major decisions prior to 1857 with the Dred Scott case, and then boom. Now he's in everyone's history books. He looks like a troll. He has the hunched over and back and everything.
He literally holds the honor of having the most awful Supreme Court decision in history.
You're exactly right.
I mean, even Plessy versus Ferguson is nice compared to that.
Exactly.
Because Plessy versus Ferguson just said separate but equal. I mean, the equality was not very equal.
No.
But at least you could see where the rule of law would apply.
Right.
You can follow the logic. Tawny, you cannot. And it makes these Northerners very desperate, so they now elect crazy people.
Right.
Crazy, almost preacher kind of people from Illinois.
Oh, yes.
A man who Well, who was the guy? Who were the two that fought on the Senate floor?
Oh, that was Preston Brooks and Charles Sumner.
Literally, it was Sumner. Yeah.
Yeah, Charles Sumner, who was from Massachusetts, and Preston Brooks from, I believe he was from the great state of South Carolina.
Wow, you can't in the imagination of the American people, especially at this time.
Yeah.
You can't imagine two polar opposites more than
Exactly.
Massachusetts for freedom and South Carolina for slavery.
Well, and the idea that Preston Brooks breaks a cane over Charles Sumner's head
Yes.
and literally cracks his skull.
So, I would have to say, C-SPAN's ratings would be much better if this happened more
Oh
frequently.
my goodness. You know, in regard to that, afterwards, after that Brooks-Sumner affair, you would find senators bringing knives
And guns.
to the Senate chamber.
I can't imagine being a 75-year-old man in the 1800s,
Oh my gosh, no.
and I'm virulently anti-slavery, that I wouldn't want to carry a gun, because there are younger men in here who definitely beat me to death.
Yes.
And I'm not going to tolerate that.
No.
And so, you have Harper's Ferry, you have
The Brooks-Sumner
you have Brooks
affair.
Sumner, you have the Lincoln Douglas debates.
Yes.
All this is, this is getting, for the first time ever, really, mass media is actually occurring.
Right.
You're getting, because you have the wire service. Samuel
Right.
Morse has given us the ability to communicate across distance.
Exactly.
And suddenly you have people in Massachusetts knowing about Lincoln and Douglas who are from Illinois.
Right.
They can't even find that on a map.
I know.
And they're reading these debates, and these debates are very often verbatim in their papers with what each person said. And people get fired up.
Yes, they do.
They already feel disempowered by this decision.
Ooh, yeah.
They've already read about all these other things going on, and the temperature is going up and up and up and up.
If you were to do a temperature check in 1858, 1859, 2 years roughly before shots fired on Fort Sumter for the first time,
First time.
you would be in hot water.
It would definitely be in the high 100s for sure.
Yes, for sure.
By
because-
1860,
Oh my gosh.
as the election starts to go.
Yes.
And as we all know, we see it every 4 years in our, still today, political temperatures rise dramatically,
Oh my gosh, yes.
especially when you get into October and November with the elections.
And here's the deal: when you especially have a president who's leaving office, who has done nothing.
He literally is probably the least active president.
Who's that? James Buchanan?
James Buchanan, which is
oh
the
my
county
gosh,
we live in.
yes. The wonderful county of Buchanan County, which of course the county seat, St. Joseph, Missouri, but still. Yeah.
He is,
that again.
He is our only bachelor president.
Yes. And it shows.
And it shows because he could have used a little refinement, I think.
I think so.
Maybe a little nudge in
nudge in the butt to really say, hey, do something about this.
because the country's falling apart.
Well, and you got to think about it. This, like I mentioned before, that Kansas-Nebraska scenario fiasco, if you really want to call it, that bleeding Kansas situation, it was not just read in Massachusetts or in California or in Florida. It was read in Liverpool. It was read in Munich.
Paris.
In Paris. They're looking at their papers and they're thinking, sacre bleu.
It's Bon Jovi.
Yeah, they're just like, oh my gosh, what are we doing to ourselves? And
What's going to happen here?
exactly.
Because America, we of course just see ourselves as a small country on a far continent. We don't consider ourselves a world power by any means at this point.
No.
But when we look at what the next 5 years after,
Oh my gosh.
after the election, 1860 to 65,
Yeah.
when you look at the number of troops that were put in the field, the amount of railroads laid down, guns built, all these things, we were a world power. We just didn't know it. But I think some of the European powers did.
Yes.
They didn't treat us that way.
No.
But I think in the back of their mind they realized I think it's one of the reasons the Monroe Doctrine worked.
Yes.
Is because quickly realized if we mess around and America gets really mad,
Whoa.
they're much bigger than they used to be.
Yeah.
They're not this little 13 colonies that finally decided to become a nation. They've got 6 or 7 million new people.
Right.
Who are, this is also the period of de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. This Frenchman comes over and makes this big tour. It used to be required reading in American government classes. American history classes to Tocqueville was
Me.
huge. Well, they don't like him because he says nice things about America.
Oh,
They don't like that
Yeah,
anymore.
we're kind of.
But I mean, a lot of his observations are still very valid about what Americans think about themselves and how they act.
Right.
And so the world knows about us,
Mm-hmm.
and which is why we get so much immigration. Because if you're rich and living in France, why would you want to move to America? That seems like a waste of time.
But if you're poor.
But if you're poor and you can scrape enough money to get to America, you might have a new life where who knows what you become.
Oh,
The
yes.
number of people who were immigrants that became wealthy, not just successful, but wealthy.
Oh, yes.
Is amazing, and it's even more so now because we have so many new ways to become wealthy.
Exactly.
You don't just have to build a giant business. I
Or-
mean, most people were farmers then.
Right.
It was going to take you generations to become a wealthy farming
Yeah.
family.
Right.
But so many of these immigrants came, they had new ideas, they thought about things in a different way. Heck, they might have had that idea while they were living in Bavaria.
But they didn't have the means.
The Lord's stuffy pants
Yes.
wouldn't let them do it because his grandfather said this is the way we do mill work.
Right.
And you have this cool new idea. Maybe
Well,
it's
that's
just a modification, but
But
it makes
still.
the job 20% easier.
Yes.
So instead of 10 hours of work, it takes 8 hours of work.
And you're increasing production.
You're increasing production. And you go to America and you do this, suddenly you're a wealthy person.
Oh my gosh. What a
And-
wonderful trade.
And even if you're not wealthy by, robber baron standards,
Right.
Carnegie's and those kind of guys.
Rockefellers and Gould.
But if you literally have hundreds of acres and you have servants that you hire,
Yeah.
if you're like talking about the coast of north coast of Ohio,
Right.
they were built on industry.
Of course.
But there's this flaw
Yes.
built into our country at the very beginning. There's no way I can see how we could have not had that flaw. There's no way the northern states would have said you have to get rid of slavery, and the southern states would have went, okay.
Yes. There's
It
just
wouldn't
no
have
way.
happened. It wouldn't have happened. And if we would have been two countries, I just don't see how the War of 1812 would have been disastrous. We probably would have been a colony again.
Right.
Because with half our country disappeared, that would have been ugly.
Oh yes.
And so, this tension builds. People are tired of this institution. The North, the peculiar institution, but again, the population north to south was much closer to equal. I mean, the first one, other than Adams, the first 5 presidents were from Virginia. So
Yes.
4 out of the first 5
Mhm.
were Virginians.
Mhm.
That tells you who had a lot of population.
Yes.
But they also tended to vote together with the South, so that helped too. But still, it's population based.
Yes.
And after that period, it shifts to Northerners almost exclusively. Ohio,
Mm-hmm. You
Tyler was from, I can't remember where.
He was, I believe, from
Harrison
Kentucky.
was Indiana.
Yes.
So I mean,
You've got people from the West, or I should say, old Northwest. But you do have some outliers like Jackson,
yeah,
who's
but
from
he's
Tennessee. But
right, but he acted more like a Northerner in a lot of
Yes.
his policies
oh my gosh, yes,
and his attitudes, I guess.
yes,
And so we're coming up like a freight train headed towards this cliff.
and we
And-
have nothing that is going to stop us.
And when you look back at, say, the Missouri Compromise,
Mhm.
you can see where maybe some tweaks might have changed things.
Sure.
And even 1850, maybe there was some hope. But
Yeah.
after 1854,
There is nothing.
and then
the subsequent
Dred Scott,
years of after
just literally-
1854, it is done.
it's like 1854 took the brakes off the train.
Yes.
57
57.
put a rocket on the back end of the train.
Yep. And ultimately by roughly 59, 60.
That's when the Roadrunner hands the Coyote his anvil.
Yes, exactly. Because by 60, with that rising tensions between not only your Southern Democrats and your Northern Democrats, but also now the introduction of that new political party, the Republicans,
Yes,
is
this
where
brand
things
new
are going to see.
kind of comes out in a lot of ways out of the Know Nothing Party.
Yes,
These little third parties
Yes.
that were very anti-slavery,
right.
but they really kind of coalesced, I guess, for
Mhm.
lack of a better word, around this anti-slavery ideal
Yes,
that nothing else, because Democrats have been around since Jackson.
right.
the other party had always been, Federalist, Republican.
Something-
It was always
something
changing
along those
every
lines.
20 years or so.
Right.
The Republican Party kind of coalesces on this issue, anti-slavery.
Yeah.
And it gets rid of the problem. The South was very dominant in politics because they voted as a group almost exclusively, whereas the North was split between Democrats and whatever other party.
Insert different party name here.
Right.
Right.
With the rise of the Republicans, the Democratic Party of the North
Died.
really, in a lot of ways, because it was still trying to defend slavery when it
Yeah.
didn't even agree with it.
Yeah.
And so you have Democrats moving to the Republican Party in mass,
Yes.
or not being very active, stay-at-home voters.
Which
Or they're
ultimately-
not giving money. That's the most important thing when you're trying to get elected to something.
Exactly.
You're not writing checks. Well, not a lot of people write checks, but
No, but if
when
you
they
were-
passed the hat, you didn't put
Right,
anything in,
right.
Because you were like, I don't
I don't
believe in
s-
slavery. I can't
yeah.
support that.
I can't continue to do something that I don't want to believe in. So
Right.
I
So I'm going to
just-
go back with these guys over here saying exactly what I believe in.
Exactly.
And telling me why it's a good thing and why not only does Thomas Jefferson like it, God likes it too.
exactly. That's it.
And so the fuse is lit.
Yes.
And so next time we'll come together. I don't know how soon that will be.
Well, it could be a couple of
Because school
weeks.
just started tomorrow and
Yes.
we'll be busy, but we'll try to
Yes.
get that done.
We'll get something out there as soon as we can. And hey, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, hit the like button, and just give
Make
us
sure
some
you're
content.
signed in before you do that.
Yes.
You can't subscribe without being signed into YouTube with an account. But once you do sign in with an account, you'll be able to get an email when we drop our new podcast. So
Right.
you know it's there.
Right.
So you're not constantly have to go to YouTube and check.
Right.
Because we're going to try to do at least one per month. Probably better than that because
Yes.
we like to talk history way too much
Oh
to
yes.
wait that
Too
long.
much time.
So probably 2 weeks would be a better estimate, but that way you're not sitting there, oh, it's been 10 days, I'm going to keep checking.
Right.
You don't need to do that. You wait for that email and you go, oh, I can
There
go
we
watch
go.
it.
We can go watch a new
Grab
episode.
yourself a Coke or a cup of coffee and sit down and watch us blather.
Yes. Well, again, thank you so much for viewing in. And again, make sure you hit that subscribe, like, and if you would like, share onto your other accounts, Facebook, Twitter, whatever it may be.
Yeah, let people know because we'd love to have your questions and comments.
Yes, any constructive criticism or anything along those lines.
We appreciate it.
God bless.